Right, well, thanks for coming. We're going to talk about electric vehicles. I mean, as you know, there's a lot of discussion about electric vehicles at the moment, and is it really where we are going? This is the question. So I'll explore some of the issues around electric vehicles. Let me know when you're all set. There you go. Right, first of all, a lot of our work on electric vehicles in the context of the Innovate project. This, as you can see from the map, is a Northwest European project. Now, the problem we've had in recent years is that there's been a lot of electric vehicle experiments taking place in different parts of Europe, and these have not been connected. A lot of them have been regional or local. So the lessons from these have not been learned for the benefit of all. So that's what we were trying to do with the Innovate project. As you can see, there are partners in Ireland, Wales, England, Belgium, the Netherlands, France and Germany. So we're in regular contact to compare notes, and we're hoping in the end to come out with a sort of template of how you would implement electric vehicle systems in your locality. So if you are a local authority, you're thinking of introducing electric vehicle scheme of some sort, then wait for the results of the Innovate project. So that partly funds our work. The other part is funded by the ESRC, Economic and Social Research Council, through BRAS. So you'll see the BRAS logo there as well. BRAS incidentally stands for the Centre for Business Relationships, Accountability, Sustainability and Society. And it's taken me 10 years to learn that. Right. Oh, this is a peculiar mouse, I'm afraid. So I don't want to end the show, no, I want to continue the show. Right, now, historically, when you mention electric vehicles in this country, people say milk floats, and here's a picture of a milk float. Now, people underestimate what these things actually did. They were, of course, slow. Well, they were not designed to be fast. They were also quiet, because if you are waiting for your milk to be delivered at 4 a.m., you don't want to be woken up by a diesel engine, and that's, of course, what this thing does perfectly. Another thing about them is they require very little maintenance, and they're very durable. There used to be an industry that produced these just up the road, and after a while, the industry sort of petered out, basically because there was no replacement demand. I took this picture about 3 years ago when this thing was still in use. By that stage, it was about 40 years old. So that's something to remember about electric vehicles. The other image that electric vehicles have in this country is this, the Sinclair C5. Now the problem is, Sir Clive Sinclair marketed this as a car. Now, you can see this was not a car, right? It is an electrically assisted human-powered vehicle, and that's how it should have been marketed. So again, when people in this country think of electric vehicles, it's a sort of fusion between milk floats and the Sinclair C5, not a very promising start. However, in recent years, it's begun to change. We've had products like this, the Tesla. Now, the Tesla is interesting in that, as an idea, it came out of Silicon Valley. Elon Musk made a lot of money, I think $180 million, from selling PayPal. By the time this was introduced, he had about $3 million left. Another significant thing about the Tesla, it's actually built by Lotus in Norfolk. And we often forget that we do have considerable expertise in this country in this field, in the whole low-carbon vehicle field. So that's your Tesla. So we're hoping that improves the image of electric vehicles a bit. Another significant change we've seen in recent years is that some of the mainstream car producers have gone in and introduced electric vehicles. Now this has just not happened before. On the left here we have the Nissan Leaf, in this particular case in a Japanese setting being charged up. And on the right we have the Peugeot Eon, which is actually a Mitsubishi i-MiEV. But Peugeot, Citroën have done a deal with Mitsubishi whereby it's sold also as a Peugeot and a Citroën, thereby spreading the risk of the original investment by Mitsubishi. So we see here electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles introduced by mainstream car makers, and that's new. Now the question is, why? Why do these changes come about if we've been making electric vehicles for a long time, as we'll see in a minute? Do manufacturers actually want electric vehicles, is the question. Well, the answer to that is no. Right? Electric vehicles would... mainstream car makers ideally would not want to make electric vehicles. So this is important to understand. What mainstream car makers would like to do is alternative fuels, right? This is stuff that you can use in existing internal combustion engines. If you just spent £500 million building an internal combustion engine factory, the last thing you want is a battery electric vehicle, because it means that that investment is essentially obsolete. So you're trying to keep that investment as long as possible. And you can do that by sticking in bioethanol, for example, or biodiesel and things like that, or as BMW is suggesting, putting hydrogen in there. And BMW is suggesting that because BMW's core expertise, as they see it, is in high-performance internal combustion engines. Once you go electric vehicle, that whole expertise that they've been building up since the 1920s would be lost. So, no, they don't want electric vehicles, right? So why are they doing it? Well, at the moment we've got a market for electric vehicles that's regulation and incentive driven, right? It's not, in a sense, a natural market. It's a regulation-driven market. And the regulatory drivers are these sort of elements. Air quality, that's been going for a while. We've been trying to control the emissions from toxic emissions from cars for some time, since the 1960s, in fact, starting in California. Climate change is a newer one, but it's a big driver, and particularly in the EU and some other countries. So CO2 reduction and this sort of thing. Energy efficiency, also important. Our economies are very dependent on oil, as you may realize, particularly transport, as we'll see in a minute, very dependent on oil. And oil has to be imported, which means we have to pay dollars for it when we import it. Makes us very dependent. That's also where the energy security thing comes in. At the moment, I mean, people may think electric vehicles are high risk, but considering what we're doing at the moment, it's actually not. We've made our whole economy very dependent on oil, which means, first of all, we're dependent on oil being available. Secondly, we're very dependent on the people who sell us the oil being prepared to give it to us. And as we've seen in recent years, it has led to wars and things like that. That doesn't sound like a very secure way to run your economy. So energy security has also popped up as a major driver for moving away from oil, or at least thinking of alternatives.
Sorry, can you speak up a bit with the air conditioning?
Oh, the air conditioning. All right, I'll try. Try to compete with the air conditioning. Right, now I said it's a regulation-driven market. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because we've seen a number of examples in the past of regulation actually leading to technological innovation. An interesting example is, for example, here the catalytic converter. Now, if we look at the catalytic converter, which again was introduced because of toxic emissions legislation from cars, if we look, for example, at the example of Johnson Matthey, a British company, when the catalytic converter was introduced, this was a banking group and a company that dealt in commodities, particularly precious metals. Now, why this is interesting to them is a catalytic converter uses rhodium and platinum, various precious metals, to create a catalytic reaction. I'm in a chemistry lab, and I'm not a chemist, by the way. I can't claim too much expertise in this area. Anyway, these guys were dealing in rhodium and platinum. They saw this technology coming along, and they said, listen, we can do this. So they turned from being a bank and a commodities company into a developer of a new type of automotive technology. In the process, they generated a lot of intellectual property rights, IPR. They created new jobs, and they created new profits. And this is a British company. So you can see how in some cases regulation can actually lead to technological innovation and can benefit the economy. So if this happens with electric vehicles, then that might be very useful. Now, as I hinted at earlier, the electric vehicle itself is not new. It's not a new technology. We've seen a recent revival of it, but it's not actually new. In fact, the oldest electric vehicle, as far as we can work it out, was this one, produced around 1840. The only problem, it's only about this big, right? You can't drive this thing. It was an experimental thing. And as a Dutchman, I'm very pleased to say this was a Dutch invention. This model still exists. It's at the University of Groningen. Very soon, people decided that you could also do these things and drive on them. However, it took a while for them to start competing with cars. But if you go back about 100 years, electric vehicles were competitive with internal combustion cars and with steam engine cars. And here is, for example, a Detroit Electric. Detroit Electric made a large number of electric vehicles. In fact, Clara Ford, the wife of Henry Ford, drove a Detroit Electric. Hers was all black. This is a very adventurous color scheme for the time. But after a while it petered out, mainly because of the invention of the self-starter by Kettering. Self-starter meant that you didn't have to crank start an internal combustion engine car. Now this was actually, we think of it now as a bit of a joke, crank starting a car, but it's actually quite a dangerous activity. A lot of people broke their arm. And what happened in fact to a friend of Charles Kettering, he broke his arm, damaged his shoulder so badly it led to gangrene, and after a few months he died. So Charles Kettering specifically decided to introduce or develop a technology that got rid of crank starting. Once this was the case, a lot of the advantages of the electric vehicle, which was that you just switched it on and drove off, disappeared. And gradually the advantage of electric vehicle got eroded. Although even at that stage, even in the 1890s, people decided electric vehicles was a much better technology for inner city use, for taxis and things like that, than internal combustion engines. Now, over the past 100 years or so, occasionally electric vehicles enjoyed a revival. Here's a Peugeot electric vehicle from the 1940s, when France was, of course, or half of France was occupied by the Nazis. Oil wasn't readily available, but they could still generate electricity. So as long as they made the vehicle small enough, they could still use them at that stage. Another brief revival was in the 1960s for emissions use, and there have been a few sort of along the way. Here was an interesting experiment. I apologize for the quality of the picture, by the way. It's all right when it's this size, but once you blow it up, it sort of goes. I took this picture in the 1970s. This is a Wittcar experiment. These are electric vehicles in Amsterdam, and they are really for shared use. So the idea was that you bought a membership to this. It's like a car club, but in the 1970s. And then you could take one of these from one of its charging stations, where they were sort of charging up from an overhead line there, and then you could take it to anywhere else in Amsterdam and leave it at the nearest charging station where you wanted to be. And this scheme operated for about 12 years. But the original plan was that they would ban all traffic, all motorized traffic from the center of Amsterdam, in which case this would have worked. But in the end, they didn't, for political reasons. So this sort of petered out in the end. It was a very interesting early experiment, not only in urban use of electric vehicles, but also shared use of electric vehicles that we might learn from. A few more prominent experiments have been run in France, particularly in the 1990s. One big one in La Rochelle, which was supported by Peugeot Citroën, where they gave 50 cars, electric cars, to people just to see how they got on with them. And another one in Mendrisio in Switzerland, the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland, where the local town decided to go all electric and promote the use of electric vehicles. One of the interesting lessons that came out of these experiments is that, in fact, most people who were using these electric cars could get sufficient charge for an overnight charge and didn't actually need to charge during the day. So a lot of people say, well, one of the barriers to the introduction of electric vehicles is a charging infrastructure around the town. A lot of these experiments show that that's not necessarily a barrier, because a lot of people don't need to charge during the day. I don't know about your experience. I mean, you race your thing, I suppose. That's a different context altogether. Yes, one of our people here arrived in an electric vehicle today. So. Right. So what has changed? What has suddenly brought about this change? Why do these big manufacturers suddenly introduce electric vehicles? Well, a number of these trends that we've sort of outlined are beginning to come together. So that has created a new situation. First of all, the technology trend. If you look at the history of the last few decades of the car, you find that virtually all the new systems we've introduced into cars are electric or electronic, except for the powertrain. So we decided to have a look at the history of powertrain. And in fact, you find that if you go back 100 years and look at the early days of the car, more and more electric systems have also been introduced in the powertrain. Even though the core element is still internal combustion, everything surrounding it has become electric or electronic. Over there, La Jamais Contente, the first car ever to do 100 kilometers per hour, and it was an electric car. So people were racing them really 100 years ago already. Understanding of aerodynamics was a bit more limited in those days than today. He sat on top of the aerodynamic cigar. But still, I mean, he beat steam cars, he beat internal combustion engine cars. He was a Belgian, by the way, one of the famous Belgians. You see, the battery electric vehicle runs all the way along. It's been with us ever since we've had cars. But what you see, more and more electric and electronic systems being introduced to control the internal combustion process. The only thing missing is that final step to get rid of the internal combustion engine itself and go for an electric powertrain. But we're very close to it. And as you can see, there's a sort of trend towards it, a path dependence, as we say, moving us towards electric powertrain. Right. Now, how do you realize it? There are, of course, different ways of realizing this. When we think of electric vehicles, we normally think of battery electric vehicles, but there are other types of electric powertrain, and they're all beginning to compete with each other. There's also the hybrid and the plug-in hybrid. Well, we know the Toyota Prius. Plug-in hybrid we've seen more recently in the form of the Vauxhall Ampera and the Chevrolet Volt. And then there's the fuel cell car. Now, 10 years ago, everybody thought the fuel cell car is the future, and it might still be the future. The only problem is this. At the bottom there, we have a Honda FCX Clarity, which is notionally the first fuel cell production car in the world. I spent some time with the engineers putting it together and keeping it on the road. They cost about $1 million each to make, right? So they're not selling them. You can lease one. If your name is Jamie Lee Curtis, you can lease one. She's got one, for example, and they just signed the lease the day before I met these guys running it. It's a beautiful car. It's very nice to drive, but there are these limitations. So they're not there yet. At the moment, another strand that's come together is the CO2 thing. Certainly in the European Union, CO2 reduction is the primary driver of policy in this area. And it also, again, moves you away from internal combustion and towards electric. So it's another one of the drivers. What we've got in place at the moment is regulation that by 2015, the average new car in the EU is only allowed to emit 130 grams per kilometer. This is not in real life. This is on the EU test cycle, right? So it's a specific controlled environment where this is tested. And this is compared to a 2010 figure in the UK of about 144.2 grams per kilometre on average. It's average of all new cars registered. In fact, the trend is such that we'll probably reach the 130 grams per kilometre this year. Despite the fact that the industry lobbied for about 18 months to get the date postponed from 2012 to 2015, right? Because the industry has actually done something about this. Here are some of the lowest CO2 emitting cars that are currently available. I've just selected the ones that have less than 100 grams per kilometre, which is well below the 130 grams, as you'll appreciate. On the other hand, if we want to sell a few SUVs, we'll have to sell quite a few that are in this league. In fact, some more recent cars have just been introduced. At the Geneva show, there were some that were down to 80 and 85 grams. So it shows that this development is still taking place. One thing you'll notice here, that most of them are diesel. In fact, there's only one with electric drive. That's the Prius. Currently available in 3 different performance versions. Therefore, the range is from 89 to 92 grams per kilometre. But still quite a lot of car for very low emissions. And you'll see quite a lot of these cars, like the Volvo C30 and things like that, are quite a lot of car for less than 100 grams per kilometre emissions. So when you force the industry to concentrate their minds, they can deliver. Now, of course, what this means, if you can do this with internal combustion, that actually makes it more difficult to then start forcing the same with electric traction. So this is why it's interesting to look at this. And it's also for this reason that electric vehicles are still not seen as the obvious answer to CO2 reduction. Many alternatives are under development, particularly more efficient internal combustion engine cars. I don't know if anybody has seen this, the Loremo. This is a German concept car. What these guys have done, they've taken all the state-of-the-art technology and weight reduction and energy efficiency, put it all into one car. And they aimed for a car about the size of a Golf, so that's about what it is. It's actually longer than a Golf to get the aerodynamic shape in, but the fuel consumption is quite remarkable, and CO2 emissions of 41 grams per kilometre on the test cycle. That's with a small diesel engine. Only produces 20 horsepower, as you can see there. It still has a top speed of 160 kilometers per hour, which by German standards is very low, of course, but it's probably adequate for most purposes. It's 100 miles per hour, after all. So if we make that the limit, then we'll probably be all right. It's got an aluminium chassis and a polyurethane body. One novel feature of it is that the rear seat passengers look back. They look through the rear window, so you sit back to back in it. It's a very elegant sort of solution, but it is internal combustion, although there is also an electric version under development. This is not a production car. This is a concept car. Somebody would need to put money into that to put it into production. Another one, Gordon Murray design. Gordon Murray, famous of McLaren racing cars and things like that. Gordon Murray set up a design consultancy a number of years ago specifically to make a far more efficient car. And the concept that they came up with is a T25. Again, small internal combustion engine, very efficient, but there's also the T27, an electric version. Of course, if you start with a small lightweight car, turning it into an electric car also makes a very efficient electric car. So it benefits both ways. And then the Axon, another British company. The core technology in this is low-cost carbon fiber technology. Steve Cousins, who is the man behind this, he decided that for normal car use, you don't need the carbon fiber technology used for Formula One or for aircraft and things like that. You can do it much cheaper. So that's what this uses. It's a very lightweight structure. Uses a 660cc Japanese petrol engine, so very simple. But it can also easily be adapted to run on battery, electric power, or also available as a hybrid. So another little car there. Now, how do these things actually perform in real life? Now, this is an interesting one. This is the Brighton to London run. Not the London to Brighton, but Brighton to London run, which is run with low-carbon vehicles specifically. This was the event run in 2010. In a few weeks, we'll get the results from the 2011 event. And these are the different vehicles that are taking part in it and their carbon emissions during the run. So these are on real roads from Brighton to London, not on the European test cycle. And as you can see, electric cars do quite well there. There is one petrol car in there, as you can see, the orange one. That's in fact the Gordon Murray T25. So you can see how, with a very efficient petrol engine, you can be right up there with electric and hybrid vehicles. Diesel not doing too well, but some lightweight diesel's doing all right. And there's a hydrogen car in there. The FCX Clarity is in the middle there. These are all life cycle emissions. So they take the UK generating mix for electric vehicles into account, where we get our electricity from. That's another important issue, because that's one of the problems. A few problems have popped up in some of these technologies. If we look at fuel cells, which are on the left, if you look at automotive fuel cell production capacity, and a lot of that is to do with Ballard in British Columbia and Canada, and then some of it is Toyota in Japan also makes it. But the projections at the moment of the capacity for automotive fuel cells, we've got about the capacity of 1.5 million maximum by 2020, about 600,000 by 2015. That means that the impact on the total number of cars sold, and by 2020 we expect that to be about 70 to 80 million a year, is really rather minor. So if we really want to reduce CO2 emissions, we can't really wait for the fuel cell technology to catch up. It'll just take too long. Another thing is, where do we get our hydrogen from? Hydrogen doesn't occur naturally in its free state on our planet. It's always stuck to something else. It can be stuck to oxygen or can be stuck to carbons, and it needs to be separated from that, and it takes energy to separate it from that. And it can take quite a lot of energy. So therefore, most of the hydrogen that's currently available is produced from fossil fuels. And because you've got an extra conversion step to get it from the fossil fuel, it makes it less efficient. Once you've got the hydrogen in your fuel cell, you've got quite an efficient system. Another problem is, I mentioned the FCX Clarity, Honda's nice big purple car. Hugo Spowers up there has a company called River Simple. He says, one of the problems is at the moment we're trying to replicate a normal petrol car. He said if you downscale a fuel cell, it becomes significantly cheaper to do. So again, he's got a small car up there, carbon fiber structure, very lightweight, with a very small fuel cell in it. And he reckons that by going that way, you can actually do a fuel cell today, because it's much cheaper than the $1 million car that Honda has got at the moment. But of course, you have a very small car. So there are still some issues around fuel cells. Battery electric vehicles, well, there is the issue of the charging infrastructure. There's some charging points in Santa Monica, California up there. But as we found, you don't necessarily need that much of a charging infrastructure. What it does do is it creates a psychological advantage, of course. People feel comfortable when they can see all those charging points all over the place. Another thing it does is it shows a public commitment. If the city of Cardiff suddenly introduced a large number of charging points, then we would all say, oh, this is a technology that the public authority is supporting. Perhaps we will buy an electric car now, even if we don't actually need to plug our car in. Another thing is, where does the electricity come from? And as we'll see in due course, this is an issue. Here we've got, well, two power. This is a nice sort of juxtaposition here. You've got a natural gas power station there, and wind generators opposite it. There's not many places in the world where you can take this picture. I took this in the Netherlands, where you get this juxtaposition. It does matter where the electricity comes from. Right, now a little case study. It's a little known fact that the Norwegians have been running quite a few electric vehicles for the last 15 years. And in fact, whenever these electric vehicle experiments in places like France finished, they've been buying up the old electric vehicles and importing them into Norway, because there are a unique range of incentives there that make it very attractive for people to run an electric vehicle. Right, what are these incentives? Well, in Oslo, it's mainly concentrated on the cities in Oslo, in Norway, Oslo, Bergen and Stavanger. You get free entry into the city. Now, like London, most Norwegian cities have a charge to go into the centre. And London calls it a congestion charge. I don't think that's the term the Norwegians use, but you have to pay to get into the centre of Oslo or Bergen. So that's free with an electric car. You get free parking. Parking is not cheap in Oslo. You get free charging. No sales tax, and sales tax on cars is very high in Norway, so this is very attractive, and no road tax. So these are very generous incentives. Now here is what they claim to be the largest public electric vehicle charging facility in the world. It's right in the centre of Oslo. And here's a Norwegian vehicle in the foreground, a Think. And again, if you look further along to that Riva there, it's not plugged in. So this shows again, this guy, and look at, this is minus 0 degrees. This is freezing, right? These are not ideal temperatures for operating a battery. But this person's obviously driven in from the suburbs in his or her Riva and said, I've got enough charge to get home tonight, even though it's minus 5 degrees. I don't need to plug it in. And I looked around, and about a third of the cars there were not plugged in. They still got the free parking, of course, and got into the city free. So they still had all those incentives. The problem now is, in Norway, given that there are all these electric vehicles there, how are they going to wean people off these incentives? And which incentives are key to people buying and running electric vehicles? Which ones can you take away without damaging the market. That's what they're struggling with now. It's also one of the issues we're trying to address in the Innovate research that we're doing. Around these set of incentives, Norway has tried to create an electric vehicle cluster, which is quite interesting and might have some lessons for us. One of the companies is Moveabout. Moveabout runs a car sharing scheme specifically with electric vehicles. That's been reasonably successful. They've been able to roll it out into Sweden and Denmark as well, and they've been over to London to see if they can set up a Moveabout scheme there. This has not yet happened. They also had an electric vehicle manufacturer, Think, which has been in and out of receivership for the last 15 years. They also have Elbil Norge, a smaller electric vehicle manufacturer. That is its picture inside its facility there. They're in receivership as well at the moment. So they are struggling a bit, really. They also have a more established vehicle cluster there, centered around Norsk Hydro, which is actually their electricity generating company, but also has aluminium facilities and things like that. And they have a number of divisions that are automotive suppliers, making, for example, the chassis for the Lotus Elise, and therefore also of the Tesla. And then Kongsberg, which is not too far from Oslo, has an automotive supply cluster which traditionally has supplied a lot into Sweden, into Saab and Volvo, for example. So they have tried to use this electric vehicle market to leverage into an electric vehicle or a more general vehicle cluster. Right, now what do customers think or end users think of this? And we've done a little survey in Innovate to try and get some of this, looking at some of the experiments in Northwest Europe, particularly the UK. And we've got some initial results which I'll share with you. We've got a much bigger event in June when we hope to have fuller results, but this is the first exposure of some of these results. And as you can see, the big barrier to electric vehicles, not surprisingly, is purchase cost, with 58% of respondents saying, listen, this is really a big barrier to us. Running cost as an issue is in second place, but of course we find in practice that with electric vehicles the picture is reversed. With internal combustion vehicles, purchase costs are low, believe me, they're low, and running costs are relatively high. With electric vehicles, the other way around. Expensive to buy, but quite cheap to run. Although people don't fully appreciate that difference. So a lot of the culture change will be to make people understand that the economics of running an electric car will be quite different. So therefore, 81% agree that a purchase price subsidy, which is what the UK government is operating at the moment, makes people more likely to buy an EV. Of course, we find that in practice, even with the subsidy, the Nissan Leaf is still a very expensive car. Right. So therefore we find that we can do electric vehicles, but the barriers really are not on the whole technological, but they are social, economic and psychological, which is actually in many respects far more difficult to break through. There are various risk perceptions along the value chain of electric vehicles that are really informed by internal combustion thinking. If you think of automotive suppliers, and we talk to them regularly, their question is really, is it really worth us investing in this? Is the market really going to be big enough? Is it worth a punt? Or shall we just wait and see? Another thing is, I make all sorts of stuff now for internal combustion engine cars. Will they still need those for electric vehicles? We're not clear about that. The car maker said, well, why should we do this in the first place if the internal combustion engine car still sells well? And if I go first, like Nissan is doing and like Renault is doing, will I actually gain an advantage? Now, if you listen to Carlos Ghosn, the boss of Nissan, he will say, yes, we will have an advantage by being in there first. Because there's so much technology involved, and sooner or later this will happen anyway. And we can afford to stick our necks out and just do this. And everybody else will be lagging behind. He's looking at Toyota, well, I was going to say just a few streets away. It's actually several towns away, several prefectures away, and looking at the advantage Toyota has gained from introducing hybrid technology. In fact, now if you talk to people who have looked at Toyota's technology and how they are able to learn the lessons from the hybrid and apply it to battery electric vehicles and fuel cell vehicles, it's quite clear they have gained a technological advantage from doing the Prius. Then the energy suppliers, they're doing all right selling us electricity, so they're really saying, well, how big is this thing going to be? Is it worth us investing in capacity? And remember, for them to invest in capacity, that's big, and it lasts a very long time. Once you add generating stations, that's a big investment. Or should we invest in these smart grids, whereby electricity can be fed back from the car into the grid? So you start using the electric vehicle as a storage system, and the grid can sense when cars need to be charged or when the electricity is needed elsewhere. One of our colleagues here in an engineering, School of Engineering, also working on the Innovate project, has a lot of expertise in this area. And then the end users, which is fleet users and private individuals, saying, well, why should I pay more for one of these electric vehicles? And another thing is, will it get me home? There is this problem called range anxiety, whereby you worry all the time, have you got enough power to get you home? Range anxiety is a new term. And what about residual values? I've now bought this thing. Will it retain its value? It's more expensive to buy than an internal combustion engine car. Will I be able to sell it for more than an internal combustion engine car? So this is another big thing. And how long is this battery going to last? Or will the battery become obsolete? Battery technology is developing very quickly. Will I be stuck with an old piece of technology and it will cost me thousands of pounds to replace? This was also a concern with the Toyota Prius, for example. However, most Priuses that were sold from 1997 onwards still used their original battery. So in fact, it's an unknown technology. Toyota didn't know how long it was going to last, put some figures on it, but in fact it's being pleasantly surprised at how long the things last. Dealers and garages. Can we make money on electric vehicles? As I mentioned earlier with the milk floats, they need less maintenance. Talking to the people at Move About, this electric vehicle car sharing scheme in Norway, they were saying, well, we bring the cars in all the time and we check the brakes and the steering and the tyres and things like that, but there's not a lot else we need to do to them, really. Right, can we do service and repair on them? Will my mechanics get a shock? This is possible. The government says, will this create jobs here or abroad? I had an interesting discussion with somebody at the European Commission last year who said, well, the Japanese are better at this anyway. Why not give it to them and buy the electric vehicles from them? Is that really the attitude we want? Right. And then the question is, what's wrong with oil anyway? We've not run out of oil yet. We can still fill up every day. So what's the problem, really? Let's have a look at oil. Peak oil. Don't know if you've heard of the concept of peak oil. It's the notion that at some stage we've taken enough oil, as much oil as we can, and then from there on there will be less and less available. Now what this graph shows is not necessarily peak oil. It offsets what we find every year against what we use every year. So the moment it goes below zero, we're actually eating into our reserves. We're borrowing from the future, if you like. So we're still finding stuff, and this is encouraging people who believe the oil will last forever. They'll say we're still finding stuff. Yes, this is true. But what we're finding is smaller reserves and more expensive to recover. Right? Another thing is we don't actually know how much we've got. There are some people who believe that there is somebody with a big dipstick who goes around oil wells and says, yes, that's right, we've got so much left. This is not the case, right? This is not happening. You self-declare your oil reserves. And of course it means that if you can borrow against your oil reserves, like when you want to build the tallest building in the world or something like that, then you can overstate your oil reserves. See, look, all this oil we've got. Surely we can borrow money at a nice rate from you. Oh, of course, yes, you've got loads of oil. So therefore you get an interesting period, particularly between 85 and 90, when a lot of countries restated their oil reserves, saying, oh, by the way, we found some more. Right? So we don't know how much oil there actually is there. We don't know for sure. We're relying on self-reporting. It's another thing to remember. And here's your peak oil thing. This is where the oil comes from at the moment. Now you see at the bottom the green one, that was the original US oil reserves. And you can see the peaking there happening around 1970. Now the first person who suggested that oil would peak is a guy called King Hubbard. He predicted in about 1958 or 59 that US oil would peak around 1970. And everybody said, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. This guy's an idiot. And look, 1970, that's when it happened. Of course, what happens immediately afterwards, you're still producing oil, but you're gradually finding less and less oil. Well, here we get all the others. Europe, that's things like the North Sea, it's Norwegian oil and stuff like that. Russia, other countries of Venezuela, Indonesia. Then there's the Middle East, big one up there. And as you can see, they stay fat for quite a long time. They have big reserves. Heavy, oil shale, stuff like that. Deep water, Gulf of Mexico, we saw that last year. And then natural gas to liquids and things like that. But we can see that a lot of them seem to peak around now. I don't know if you spotted this. So it's a bit of a risky future. No, that's fine. Of course, our economy can use other fuels as well until we start looking at transport. Funnily enough, transport is very oil dependent. Very, very, very oil dependent. So although we can run our electricity generating stations on natural gas and all sorts of other stuff, at the moment with the technology we've got on the roads, we are very dependent on oil. Got a bit of LPG there, used a lot in taxis, used a lot in the Netherlands because it's cheap and we like things that are cheap in the Netherlands. Biofuels, that's mainly Brazil. And then CNG, compressed natural gas, quite a bit in India, a bit in Argentina, but very marginal compared to oil. And then we come back to this famous statement by Sheikh Yamani, Saudi Arabia oil minister in the 1970s. He was a very clever chap. Did a lot of the negotiations on the part of OPEC in the 1970s that forced us to pay more for our oil. He said, do remember, to his own people primarily, the Stone Age didn't end because they ran out of stones. It ended because they found something better. And he was suggesting the same would happen to oil. He said, be very careful overcharging for our oil because those guys out there can probably find something better. Similarly, once oil has peaked, we will not run out of oil. As you could see from the peaking, we've got many decades of oil left, hundreds of years of oil left, but it will just become very, very expensive. That's the thing. Once it becomes very expensive, then we might well find better solutions to it. And that's in fact what Sheikh Yamani was talking about. So is it time, going with Sheikh Yamani's expression, to move out of the Stone Age and look for different alternatives? It's important to remember that within 1 or 2 generations, many of the minerals we dig out of the ground and rely on today, especially fossil fuels, will no longer be abundant or cheap. It's not just fossil fuels, a number of other things as well. That they won't run out. They will just become very expensive, very scarce. That basically means that the cars we make today will no longer be viable. Certainly not viable in the way we use them today. You might be able to use it occasionally on a Sunday, but that's about it. So that means that if you are a company like Toyota or Nissan, or a country like Germany that still want to be in the car business in the future, you need to rethink what you're going to do. You need to think in terms of new materials and new energy sources, right? Move into the solar age, as some people have suggested. Right. William McDonough is an environmentalist and an architect. And I went to a talk by him. He wrote a marvelous book called Cradle to Cradle, which you may have heard of. But I went to a presentation by him, and he said, the problem is this. We're still working according to the basic design principle of the first industrial revolution. And this is it. If brute force is not working, you're not using enough of it. Funnily enough, about 10 years ago, I did a presentation for a bunch of BMW engineers, and I put this up, and nobody laughed, which I thought was very worrying. Anyway, William McDonough says, William McDonough, by the way, remodeled the River Rouge factory in Detroit, which is the sort of iconic Ford car factory, where iron ore went in at one end and cars came out the other end. The factory still exists, but William McDonough completely remodeled it. It's now got grass on the roof and things like that. It's become very environmentally optimized. So he does do something productive as well as creating beautiful quotes. Anyway, we need to rethink. We need a new industrial revolution. So the question then is, coming back to electric vehicles, are electric vehicles really the solution to all these problems? Well, first of all, oil will become too much hassle, going with Sheikh Yamani's dictum. Cost of extraction, environmental impact, social and political impact. This is not going to happen tomorrow. This will be a gradual process. But the sooner we prepare for it, the better, really, right? New oil sources that people are very optimistic about, such as the shale oil, the tar sands in Alberta and things like that, are all very well, but they all generate significantly higher carbon. So if our priority is to reduce carbon, that is not really the way to go. Other key resources will also become scarce. Unfortunately, some of these are also needed for electric vehicles. There are other minerals that are becoming scarce, so we have to rethink a lot of stuff. However, on the optimistic side, our ability to tap into non-fossil sources such as solar is improving all the time. I mean, if you'd said sort of 30 years ago that the rural Wales would be full of wind generators which would actually be generating electricity, people would have laughed. In fact, a lot of people still do. They ignore the fact that Denmark now gets between 15 and 20% of all its energy from wind. They obviously haven't realized it doesn't work. All of these alternatives also translate into electric power, right? So that means that if we go for EVs, we've got a lot of flexibility. It doesn't really matter where we get our power from, but all these alternatives to oil seem to generate electricity, and even oil can generate electricity. So if we go for EVs, we are actually hedging our bets. We can opt for a lot of different technologies in the future, a lot of different energy sources, and we can still run our cars, which is not true for our current cars, which are really dependent on liquid fuel sources. Now, how efficient are electric vehicles? I'm indebted here to a guy called Gary Kendall. His background is actually in the oil industry. He worked for BP for many years, but he came to the conclusion that the future was not in oil, so he doesn't work for BP anymore. He works for a consultancy called Sustainability now. And he did a lot of calculations on alternative energy sources for vehicles. So he's looking there, plant to tank, right? This is from extraction to tank, first of all. Plant efficiency for the liquid pathway, as he calls it, which is oil-based in most cases, 83%. For the electron pathway between 35 and 42%. So it's quite clear that the liquid pathway there is far more efficient, right? That's why electric vehicles can't quite compete there. Transmission and distribution, a specific electron issue, is quite efficient. Then we go tank to wheels. That's once we've got the stuff in the car to the wheels. That's where the electron pathway is far more efficient, right? So that means that overall, if you add them all together, and these are not my figures, these are Gary Kendall's figure, if you take a life cycle approach, which we've not traditionally done with oil cars, you find that in fact a battery electric vehicle is slightly more efficient overall than a liquid fuel vehicle. So you could actually argue that electric vehicles already are inherently more efficient, looking at a tank-to-wheel equation. But it does matter where the electricity comes from, particularly in emission terms. And here's an interesting comparison also using Gary Kendall's figures, whereby there's various different comparisons. First of all, at the bottom we've got diesel and petrol. This is our existing technologies, and it shows the CO2 intensity of those technologies. The next one up is running a battery electric vehicle in the US. And you can see it's quite a bit better than petrol or diesel. Then running a battery electric vehicle in California. This is to do with California's energy mix. They've got a lot of hydro, they've got solar, they've got a lot of wind. If you drive from LA to Palm Springs, which we did a few years ago, you'll pass the largest concentration of wind generators in the world. It's a forest of wind generators because there's a gap in the mountains there that really attracts very strong winds. So quite spectacular. It's been there for quite a long time. It means that the whole of Palm Springs, for example, gets wind power. Again, they haven't realized that wind power doesn't work, so don't tell. Battery electric vehicle in the EU. Next one up. This is the EU average generating mix of all the 27 member states. Not as good as California, but better than the US average. So you actually, despite the fact that the Americans are much keener on electric vehicles than we are, we actually have a greater advantage in CO2 terms running them in the EU than the Americans have. Then Austria. Austria has a lot of hydro, of course. So Austria is even better than California. However, my apologies here, Greece is awful. Running an electric vehicle in Greece, you may as well run a diesel car, right? So it really does matter. Greece is mainly cold, I suppose, is it? Yeah, the Greeks are up there, yeah. There's a cluster of Greeks up there. So there you go. So if we're going this way, we really need to check where our electricity comes from. Now, what does it mean in real life? This is a more recent calculation, which I picked up in a New Scientist recently. How am I doing for time? All right, I think. Nearly there. Nobody's asleep yet. Right. This again looks at well-to-wheel emissions based on the US and EU average grid. So looking at real cars in this case rather than averages. At the bottom we've got a petrol Honda Civic, so a normal petrol engine car. Honda Civic is chosen because it's for sale both in North America and in Europe. CNG Honda Civic, already you see from CNG you get a CO2 advantage there, compressed natural gas. And that's the Chevy Volt. Now the Chevy Volt is a plug-in hybrid, right? It runs on pure electric mode for about 50 kilometers. And then it changes, then the heat engine kicks in and generates electricity. Only generates electricity, it doesn't drive the wheels. So the wheels are still driven by electricity, but the electricity generated by petrol that's in your petrol tank. However, the calculation here is based on the Chevy Volt only running in electric mode from having been plugged in, getting electricity from the grid. Slightly worse than the Nissan Leaf, which is lighter than the Volt. And then we've got the same for the EU generating mix. And again, we see that the EU has an advantage in terms of our generating mix compared to the US. US does use a lot of coal to generate electricity. But again, you see in all cases, it's better than using petrol or diesel. And this is measuring real cars in this case. Another thing is, if we don't go this way, if we don't do this technology in Europe, there are plenty of others waiting to do it for us, right? I was in India last week and picked up this nice article in the Hindu where they were flagging up the fact that Ratan Tata launched a plug-in hybrid electric car there at the Geneva Motor Show. And Tata is quite keen to put this thing into production. They reckon they can put this into production in about 18 months. Right? They have the technological expertise to do this, together with suppliers to do this. Another one is BYD over there in China. BYD stands, by the way, for Build Your Dream. BYD is a battery company. Now, as you may have noticed, a lot of the gadgets we carry with us and have in our houses are made in China, right? They have Chinese batteries in them, quite a lot of them. Your iPhone has a Chinese battery. The Chinese know how to make batteries because they make them all the time. They make more batteries than anybody else. This is a battery company that's moved into making cars. This has never happened before. They say, we've got the battery expertise. All we need to do is put a car around and we've got an electric car. So they're actually making these things. They are also available with internal combustion engine, but BYD makes electric cars today. And as you can see, they look like normal cars. Sold in China at the moment. So there are plenty of people out there who are willing to do this if we get cold feet. Right. However, I said the social issues, economic issues are the main barriers. We need a rethink from the consumer. And prior to this, we had a discussion. You arrived in your electric car, and you said, well, people need to use them differently. We need to think of them in a different way. We cannot necessarily replicate what an internal combustion engine car has done for us so far. So a consumer education, re-education process might be needed. First of all, they cost more to buy. But remember, they cost a lot less to run. Now, a lot of the cost is due to the cost of the battery. If you look, for example, at the Think in Norway, the little red thing I showed you in the foreground in Oslo, the actual car costs as much as the battery, right? Cars we can do, batteries are expensive. But the running costs are lower. The fuel, electricity, is cheaper, a lot cheaper. Less maintenance, more durable. We saw the milk float, 40-year-old milk float, still at that time in regular use. It's now been retired. And a lot of people want that charging infrastructure, even though the research shows that very few people actually need it. They need it for psychological reasons, for social, political reasons, to show there's a commitment from the authorities. Range is an issue for the battery electric vehicle. Now, most people don't travel very far in their car. So actually for most people in real life, the range is not really an issue. They will never do that range. However, if you're really worried about that, there's always the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. That's an option. Like the Chevrolet Volt here. It could be a good compromise for several reasons. First of all, you get rid of your range anxiety. This is a cure for range anxiety. Because once you run out of your battery electric range, your engine kicks in. So you're all right. Also, a lot of people say, well, once people have one of these, a lot of people may find that the engine never kicks in. That in fact they don't actually need that heat engine at all. And then they may say, well, I don't actually need that heat engine. I can buy a battery electric car. Another thing is, of course, that all the investment in the electric vehicle technology that goes into a vehicle like that also benefits battery electric vehicles and eventually fuel cell vehicles, because a lot of the technology is common. So this might be an interesting interim solution. So what will actually happen? I need a drink for this one. Well, of course, I don't know. But we'll have a stab at it, right? We'll be looking at the industry for decades. We've got some ideas. We're looking at trends, see where they're going, and we can have a stab. And here's a forecast for how the mix of vehicle technologies might pan out over the next few decades. As you can see, even by 2030, there's still a lot of internal combustion. Why is that? Well, we've seen internal combustion is fighting back. It's trying to mimic some of the low carbon benefits of the electric powertrain. So they are becoming more efficient. And at the Geneva show, we did see some vehicles that can do 80 to 85 grams per kilometer. We also saw the Lorimo at 41 grams per kilometer. So there's a lot of things that can still be done with internal combustion engine. But ultimately, they will all need a liquid fuel, which we get from oil or perhaps natural gas or coal. But we are limited to those fossil fuels to do this. Right, fuel cell vehicles at the top still marginal, because we saw earlier on the capacity of making fuel cells is still going to be quite small by 2030. First sort of proper production capacity will be in place in a few years. But of course the people like Ballard and Toyota will sit back and say, we'll see how these things sell first before we invest in more capacity. So that will take a few years. Then building the capacity will take a few years. So again, by 2030, fuel cell technology will still not be a major element of this. Then we've got the battery electric vehicles. Now you may say this is a small element, but look at how much it grows. It multiplies several times over. This is several 100% growth I'm showing here. But of course, so many internal combustion engine vehicles are sold that it still looks like a small percentage. But this is actually quite a few vehicles. Then there's the normal hybrid, let's call it. the Toyota Prius type, we see it growing and then declining. Why? Because most people will probably say the plug-in hybrid is more attractive. As oil becomes more expensive and electricity doesn't come as much more expensive, I'd rather be able to plug my hybrid in occasionally to save a bit on oil, right? And I can do that with my plug-in hybrid. So this is how we've sort of thought it through. You can agree or disagree. I'm quite happy for any comments, but this is how we're seeing the future at the moment. Right, that's it. Any questions? Thank you.